Back to the 87th online episode of Peacetime, hosted every Sunday morning by Peace Point with myself, Phra Nicholas Thanissaro, coming to you from the IMC in Azusa, California. In the previous session, we looked at the Aggañña Sutta, and today we'll take a little detour from our journey through the anthology of the important suttas from the Buddhist scriptures, giving me the chance to share, for those of you who missed it, some of my recent experiences from helping out with a novice ordination project in Indonesia. First session will be a reformatting of a talk I gave in person for the Sunday morning meditation class at Azusa Temple on New Year's Eve. So today I expect today's session will take about 1 hour with a 50-minute talk on the situation of Buddhism in Indonesia, half an hour of meditation, and 15 minutes on the teaching I was doing in Indonesia. So for those of you who have been keeping track, you will have noticed that I disappeared for a week over Christmas, and in fact I was fulfilling a long-standing invitation to travel to Indonesia, because at the end of the year it's customary for the Buddhist youth of Indonesia to spend the holiday season training themselves spiritually in various ways, whether it's youth camps or ordinations. And the Dhammakaya branches, which we have in Indonesia, were organizing a training program for young monks over the course of 2 weeks. So I agreed to go and help out with some of the teaching for that ordination scheme. And the place which they chose the ordination very suitably was the place of pilgrimage in Indonesia known as Borobodur. So in the center of the island of Java is a place which itself has quite a colorful history. It's actually just over 1,000 years old. So it was built in Common Era 800 out of the volcanic rock andesite. So gray colored, a little bit like pumice, but more resistant than that. And the actual form of the pagoda has led it to be given the tagline, the biggest temple in the world. I'm not sure exactly how they calculate that, but it definitely has a lot of detail on the actual pagoda itself. There are 2,672 relief panels of Jataka stories and 504 Buddha statues inside those little mini pagodas and along the walkways. And if you think about the technology available at the time for how you could materially represent a Buddha statue inside a transparent bubble, then this was probably pretty much at the forefront of craftsmanship at the time. In fact, Indonesia in those days was a Buddhist hub, and from Indonesia, Buddhism spread to many other places, including modern-day Malaysia and also Cambodia. But what you notice if you can read the legend on this map is that it wasn't Theravada Buddhism, so not our Buddhism, but it was more the Chinese Buddhism mixed up with the Tibetan form of Buddhism. So the royal Sailendra dynasty, which provided the actual architects of Borobudur, was in fact a mixture of Buddhists and Hindus, which ruled over a kingdom that spread out from Java to all over Asia. So you might be aware that Buddhism is sometimes divided into 3 denominations: Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. These are the main 3 denominations, which have some differences between them in terms of practices and, for example, dietary customs. It's important to point out, first of all, that in the very beginning there was not a variety of schools of Buddhism. But at some stage along the way, most people put it about 1,000 years into Buddhist history, there started to be a diversification. And mostly this is to do with the geographic differences, where from India, even if you can see from this map, the tradition that spread south from India tended to become what is known today as Theravada Buddhism. Mostly the emphasis in this school is on personal enlightenment, like get yourself sorted out or enlightened first, and once you are in a good place, then you can help out other people. So a personal vocation for your spiritual practice. Dietary-wise, there's no particular prescriptions for Theravada Buddhism apart from not drinking alcohol. As for the Buddhism that spread northwards, this became Mahayana Buddhism, so the red arrows in this particular diagram, and this would include also the Vajrayana Buddhism, which is sometimes considered Mahayana too. But once it got as far as, let's say, Tibet, then the Buddhist tradition that stayed there became Northern Buddhism, which would today be known as Vajrayana or Tibetan Buddhism. Again, no dietary special requirements. But from there, some parts of the tradition continue to spread east into what would be areas of China, Japan, and Korea, becoming the Eastern tradition of Buddhism. With the Vajrayana and also Mahayana, in contrast to Theravada, the idea is generally that you need to be selfless in the way you help other people in order to find out who you really are. So there's a broader inspiration for practice where you express compassion to many other people, not just to do your own practice, but you express your practice by helping other people. So it's more inclusive as a way of practicing Buddhism. Often it's seen as a lay movement, so the monastic side of things is not so much emphasized as in the Theravada. In fact, lay people can spread Buddhism perfectly well in the Mahayana, and consequently, monasticism is not seen as mission critical as it might be in the southern tradition. And often with the Mahayana, devotees adopt the Bodhisattva vows, where killing living beings would be interpreted as meaning that you can't eat meat, because to eat meat would be tantamount to killing living beings. So generally, vegetarianism would be connected with Mahayana Buddhism, but in the Vajrayana, Buddhists tend to eat anything. But the interesting thing for Indonesia is that the different Buddhist denominations got along very well, and they worked together. They sent monks over to Cambodia, which is right on the border of all the green arrows there, which is the Theravada. So it's obviously a big overlap between the two. And thus you would see this admixture reflected in the architecture of temples which show features that are both Theravada and Mahayana. People in the old days didn't see a big difference between the two. For our particular Dhammakaya tradition, I should say, geographically we are a Theravada tradition, so we subscribe to all the monastic lineages of Thailand, but yet our approach tends to be very much affected by the Mahayana way of doing things, in that we have a more social conscience of giving something back to society. So Dhammakaya are a little bit of both. So really, Borobodur was the center of the spiritual universe for that part of the world in those days. But later on, when for various reasons Buddhism went into decline, even the pagoda itself got covered up by volcanic dust and eventually overgrown until people couldn't even remember where it was anymore. So it was lost to the world until the 19th century when, like many other of the archaeological sites of Buddhism, fortunately it was rediscovered by Western archaeologists who, in that colonial era, went around digging things up. A cooperation sprung up between British and Dutch engineers who managed to salvage Borobodur, and UNESCO was one of the organizations which helped provide funds for restoration until, in the present day, ironically speaking, for a country which is no longer really a Buddhist country, it is like a heritage landmark for all the Indonesians who feel a connection to it as part of their national history. In fact, I visited Indonesia back in 2007, and in those days our temple didn't really have any branches or infrastructure there at all. All we were doing was basically checking it out to see what the possibilities were. So, almost 20 years ago. And since that time, our temple has grown to have 3, imminently 4 branches on different islands in the Indonesian archipelago. And we have monks who stay there all year round now. But it was not at all easy to set up those branches because, although Indonesia is what you could call a religious country, and I say that because the state requires each of its citizens to select which religion they belong to, because it's not acceptable to be an atheist since they did away with atheism along with communists back in about 1965. Since that time, if you are an Indonesian citizen, you have to stand up and be counted in your own religious demographic. The proportion of Buddhists in the country is about 0.7%, which doesn't maybe sound like very much, but there's such a huge population in Indonesia that adds up to almost 2 million Buddhists in the country. So around this time of year, then the Buddhist families try to find something for their children to learn about Buddhism because although from school they might get some theoretical knowledge about Buddhism, they don't get any training in the practical side of things like meditation and living the life of a monk. So what I went to do was mostly to give lectures to these youngsters who had ordained, and the number this year was higher than usual. There was a total of 500 who signed up this year, and one way or another, about 450 of them made it through the ordination process. So they started with a candlelight celebration on the 23rd of December, a little bit like the one we organized in Azusa, but on a much larger scale with about 2,000 people instead of our normal 200. So you can see the monks gathered on the podium. Behind them were the novices who took ordination. The whole event was organized in front of Borobodur itself. Because it was a grand event, it was given official recognition, not by the religious ministry in Indonesia, I should add, but more by the education and culture ministry, because the religious ministry is mostly made up of Islamic clerics who are completely unapologetic about glossing over minority religions. But they appreciate the cultural side of Buddhism. As long as a Buddhist event can come over as aesthetic and touristy, the administration is all for it. So we had the minister come and give a little speech, and a large mixed delegation and their families joined, all of them from the ministry. So about 2,000 people in all joined the candlelight ceremony. You can see the minister there in the center wearing the national dress of a batik shirt, and many of the civil servants, including the minister, are actually Muslims. So if their wives attend, then they are wearing their hijab. Generally, Muslims would not like to be seen joining a ceremony from another religion, but in this case they made an exception. And it was the case that in the olden times in Indonesia, really, it wasn't a big deal which religion you belonged to or sympathized with. And in those days, everyone got along just fine. But since the 1990s, there's been a transformation in the way Islam has been interpreted in Indonesia, where it's become slightly more radicalized, especially in Sumatra, and from people being Muslim without necessarily wearing a headscarf. In those days, going back to the 1990s, only about 5% of women wore the hijab. Now the numbers are up close to 87%. So things have changed pretty quickly for whatever reason, even though the government officially prefers moderate forms of religion in the country. So we had a candle lighting in honor of the novice ordination, and the message which was lit up there is the message Samanera Papaja, which means the ordination of novice monks. And we also lit and launched sky lanterns, which was a precious opportunity because it's hard to find anywhere where you're allowed to release those anymore. You definitely can't release them in California for fear of wildfires. Elsewhere, it's out of fear of disturbing the aviation. But in the middle of the Indonesian jungle, it's not so much of a problem. So it's a very beautiful experience to be able to release sky lanterns because they all seem to rise up towards the moon and then disappear into the moon and all follow each other. Some people say it's almost like releasing spirits up into the sky. It's a beautiful sight to see. So here's a photo of me helping to release the sky lanterns. So here are the novices, about 500 of them. They were mostly Indonesian youngsters. So the youngest was about 7 years old, but mostly they were teenagers, so school age, and the oldest was 101 years old. They had traveled from all over the Indonesian archipelago, including distant islands like Lombok and Papua. Some of them had taken several days to travel to Java by boat or plane. So 500 of them. And I was surprised to see that there were even some Westerners who had managed to come and join the project as well. One guy here called Anton was originally from Ukraine, but he's one of those digital nomads who these days has settled in Bali because he knew that if he returned to his own country, then he would be conscripted. Actually, he had been a Buddhist for a long time, following what's known as Diamond Way Buddhism. So it's a Tibetan-style tradition in Ukraine. His parents previously hosted a meditation center on the first floor of their house in Kherson. Unfortunately, their house got bombed completely flat, so there's no more meditation center in Kherson anymore. But he says he managed to continue his practice in Indonesia instead. So he became a monk, closely shaven and transformed here, and benefiting from the monastic training. I also met a lady called Daria from Poland, who I'd come across previously in England. She'd come to help out behind the scenes in the ordination with many of the volunteer tasks. In fact, there were about 200 volunteers. So we had 500 novices, another 200 volunteers, mostly ladies, often from the university. And during the year, their main task is to organize a quiz contest called IMEC on Buddhist themes for the university students. That's very well subscribed to in Indonesia. So they all came and helped out here. You can imagine all those little lights which make up the letters on the grass had to have all the batteries changed for every last LED light, a task that requires a lot of volunteers, so a lot of people were involved. So having set ourselves up with a backstory before we embark on what I was actually teaching about in Indonesia, let's take a break halfway through and settle ourselves for 30 minutes of meditation, which today is a recent French language recording of a meditation on the 7 bases of the mind. So if at this time you would like to find a comfortable sitting position for yourself as you listen to my guidance. J'aimerais commencer par inviter chacun de vous à trouver une position de méditation confortable. En tailleur, votre jambe droite croisée au-dessus de votre jambe gauche, ou assis sur une chaise, le dos bien droit. Posez votre main droite sur votre main gauche, de manière que la pointe de votre index droite touche celle de votre pouce gauche, paume vers le haut, main reposant sur vos cuisses. En pratique, vous pouvez adopter n'importe quelle autre variation plus relâchée de cette position, une qui vous aide à vous sentir plus à l'aise lorsque vous méditez. À peu près n'importe quelle position excepté allongée. L'important est de vous sentir alerte tout en étant détendu. Votre position corporelle doit être suffisamment confortable pour que votre respiration et votre circulation ne soient pas entravées et pour minimiser toute douleur possible, tout ce qui pourrait perturber la continuité de votre attention. Pour commencer, nous relâchons chaque muscle de notre corps. Nous relâchons chaque muscle en commençant par les muscles de notre front, nos sourcils et nos paupières, en prenant soin de s'assurer que nos yeux ne sont fermés que très légèrement. Faites attention à ce qu'il n'y ait pas de pression autour de vos yeux. Les yeux ne sont jamais fermés avec force pendant la méditation, mais très délicatement, de la même manière que nous fermons les yeux quand nous nous endormons. Ensuite, nous relâchons les muscles de notre visage, de notre cou, de nos 2 épaules, de nos 2 bras, avant-bras et mains, jusqu'au bout de nos doigts. Nous les relâchons tous complètement avant de passer à la détente des muscles de notre poitrine, de notre torse et de notre abdomen, de nos 2 jambes jusqu'au bout de nos orteils, de sorte que de la tête jusqu'au bout des pieds, il ne reste plus aucune tension. Si nous ressentons toujours du stress ou de la tension dans notre corps, nous essayons de les relâcher autant que possible, car un corps complètement détendu donnera la sensation de se fondre dans l'atmosphère qui nous entoure. Nous laissons son souci corporel et nous permettons de tourner toute notre attention à la détente de notre état d'esprit. Pour détendre l'esprit en préparation à la méditation, nous devons lâcher temporairement toutes les pensées concernant nos vies en mettant de côté toute inquiétude ou préoccupation, que ce soit par rapport au travail, aux amis, à la famille,
aux études ou à toute autre chose. À la place, nous concentrons notre attention sur la tâche en cours, sur le travail avec l'esprit, tout en remplissant notre esprit d'un sentiment de bonheur et de joie, comme s'il était tout entier rempli de minuscules particules de ce bonheur et de cette joie, remplissant tellement l'esprit qu'il n'y a plus aucune place pour d'autres pensées. Ainsi, nous rendons notre esprit spacieux, léger, rayonnant et réfléchi, car toutes les qualités sont celles d'un esprit qui glissera aisément vers un sentiment d'harmonie et d'unité, alors que nous nous engageons dans la méditation qui suit. Lorsque nous nous sentons détendus, tant physiquement que mentalement, très doucement et sans effort aucun, nous pouvons ramener notre esprit vers cette image imaginaire, une sorte d'objet lumineux dans l'esprit, un soleil brillant, une pleine lune, une étoile scintillante, peut-être un diamant étincelant. Peu importe ce que vous trouvez le plus facile à imaginer, et gardez à l'esprit que cela peut être davantage un sentiment qu'une image, comme si vous ressentiez la présence de l'objet par la manière dont il se fait sentir, par son poids et sa texture, sa forme et sa position. Donc, soit un objet mental visuel, soit un objet que nous détectons par la sensation qu'il procure. Nous imaginons que l'objet flotte juste devant notre visage, sans trop nous soucier du réalisme de l'objet en lui-même. Cela se développera avec le temps. Nous imaginons l'objet sans effort, tout en réduisant la taille jusqu'à ce qu'il ne mesure plus que 2 ou 3 millimètres de diamètre et qu'il flotte devant notre nez, à l'entrée de la narine gauche pour les dames, à celle de la narine droite pour les messieurs, un point connu sous le nom de première base de l'esprit. Une fois arrivé à ce point, l'objet s'arrête immobile et nous rendons l'objet aussi réaliste que possible, tout en entendant le son de ce mantra traditionnel qui traverse l'esprit avec des mots tels que Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, qui sont les mots indiens pour désigner un état d'esprit pur atteint de la manière juste. Et en pratique, vous pouvez remplacer ce mantra par tout autre mantra ou affirmation qui vous convient mieux. Il s'agit simplement d'un mécanisme pour aider à libérer l'esprit des pensées. À partir de là, nous faisons monter lentement l'objet lumineux dans l'espace de notre nez, à l'intérieur de la narine gauche pour les dames et de la droite pour les messieurs. Montons doucement jusqu'à atteindre un point de l'intérieur du nez, juste à côté du coin de l'œil, au point où naissent les larmes, au point connu sous le nom de deuxième base de l'esprit. Ici encore, l'objet s'arrête, immobile, et nous rendons notre objet aussi réaliste que possible, tout en entendant le son du mantra traverser l'esprit avec les mots Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang. Et de ce point, l'objet se déplace lentement en arrière au niveau des yeux, vers le centre de notre tête, jusqu'à atteindre un point sur notre ligne médiane, juste entre nos deux oreilles, un point appelé troisième base de l'esprit. Ici, une fois de plus, l'objet s'arrête et nous rendons l'objet aussi réaliste que possible, tout en entendant le son du mantra qui traverse l'esprit avec les mots Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang. Gardez à l'esprit que si vous perdez contact avec l'objet en un moment quelconque de ce processus, vous pouvez simplement revenir à l'endroit où vous l'avez vu en dernier. Il n'est pas nécessaire de recommencer depuis le début. Et du centre de notre tête, l'objet intérieur poursuit maintenant son voyage vers le bas, descendant le long de notre ligne médiane jusqu'à atteindre un point au niveau du palais ou du toit de notre bouche. Un point connu sous le nom de quatrième base de l'esprit. Et si une fois encore, l'objet s'immobilise et nous le rendons aussi réaliste que possible, tout en entendant le son du mantra qui traverse notre esprit avec les mots Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang. Et du palais de notre bouche, l'objet continue son voyage vers le bas, descendant dans l'espace de notre gorge jusqu'à atteindre un point juste derrière de notre paume de la dame, un point connu sous le nom de cinquième base de l'esprit. Ici encore, l'objet s'arrête et nous rendons l'objet aussi réaliste que possible, tout en entendant le son du mantra traverser l'esprit avec les mots Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang. Ensuite, depuis le centre de notre gorge, l'objet continue sa descente, pénétrant dans l'espace de notre corps. À ce moment-là, nous pourrions imaginer qu'on nous se trouve simplement une coquille vide, sans organes ni tissus, sans muscles ni os, et notre objet lumineux descendre le long de notre ligne médiane, traversant notre poitrine, descendant à travers notre torse, et finalement se déplace dans l'espace de notre abdomen. Au niveau de notre nombril, si nous imaginons deux fines lignes, l'une partant de notre nombril horizontalement à travers notre dos et la seconde partant du côté droit vers le côté gauche. Le point d'intersection de ces deux lignes imaginaires est connu sous le nom de sixième base de l'esprit. Notre objet intérieur se déplace vers le bas jusqu'à ce qu'il s'aligne avec l'intersection des deux lignes et une fois de plus, il s'immobilise alors que nous rendons l'objet aussi réaliste que possible, tout en entendant simultanément le son du mantra qui traverse l'esprit avec les mots Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang. L'objet se déplace maintenant vers le haut, à 2 doigts d'épaisseur au-dessus du niveau du nombril jusqu'au dernier point de la séquence, connu sous le nom de septième base de l'esprit. Une fois atteint ce point, nous n'avons plus besoin de déplacer notre objet imaginaire ailleurs. Nous maintenons notre objet intérieur à ce point en nous qui se trouve également être au centre de notre diaphragme, qui est aussi notre plexus solaire et qui est également le point où le souffle se retourne entre l'inspiration et l'expiration. Ainsi, nous conservons maintenant notre objet intérieur à ce point, aussi continuellement que possible, aussi longtemps que possible, un point qui est le véritable centre de gravité du corps. Tout le temps, nous entendons le son du mantra Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, comme si la source du son était au même endroit, la septième base de l'esprit, tout en gardant notre objet intérieur aussi réaliste que possible au centre de nous-mêmes. Si notre attention se disperse sur d'autres choses, à chaque fois, nous la ramenons simplement à la septième base de l'esprit comme auparavant. Si l'objet intérieur disparaît, nous pouvons en créer un nouveau. Mais s'il change, nous le suivons simplement dans sa nouvelle forme légèrement et doucement. À mesure que nous poursuivons cet exercice, nous constaterons que l'objet intérieur deviendra progressivement plus clair pour nous. De même, les sensations dans l'esprit deviendront de plus en plus claires, mais en même temps, le nombre de pensées dans l'esprit diminuera progressivement. Elles seront de moins en moins présentes jusqu'à ce que notre objet intérieur atteigne ce qu'on appelle un arrêt au centre de nous-mêmes. Au début, nous constaterons que l'esprit a tendance à vagabonder, parfois vers les sons qui nous entourent, vers les pensées dans notre tête ou vers les sensations de notre corps. Surtout si nous sommes novices en méditation, nous ne devrions pas être déçus par cela, mais dès que nous nous en rendons compte, nous ramenons simplement notre esprit à l'objet intérieur en nous et au son du mantra, jusqu'à ce qu'éventuellement notre conscience développe un sentiment de familiarité avec ce point au centre de nous-mêmes et que l'esprit commence à rester au centre du corps plus ou moins par seconde nature. Ainsi maintenant, nous cultivons notre esprit sur la bonne voie au centre de nous-mêmes grâce à notre objet intérieur et aussi en entendant le son du mantra dans notre esprit. Encore et encore, pour quelques instants de plus en silence, jusqu'à ce que nous arrivions au moment approprié. Nous continuons donc à garder notre esprit sur le bon chemin, au centre de nous-mêmes, avec une attention légère et douce, aussi continuellement que possible, aussi longtemps que possible. Chaque fois que l'esprit s'égare, comme cela arrivera inévitablement, nous le ramenons simplement jusqu'à ce que l'esprit commence à se sentir plus à l'aise au centre de nous-mêmes. En même temps, on tandem avec la visualisation au centre de nous-mêmes. Nous pouvons continuer avec le son du mantra émanant du même endroit en nous, encore et encore avec les mots Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, Samma Arahang, jusqu'à ce qu'à un certain moment dans notre méditation, nous trouvions que le son du mantra s'éteint de lui-même. Et s'il n'y a plus de pensée émergente dans l'esprit, il ne restera plus qu'un esprit pur, clair et lumineux au centre du corps. Si à ce stade, il n'y a plus de pensée pour irriter l'esprit, alors qu'il n'est plus nécessaire de recommencer avec le mantra. Nous cultivons simplement l'esprit au centre du corps en silence. Et alors que l'esprit atteint un sentiment de tranquillité, des sensations de bonheur et de pureté lumineuse commencent à surgir d'elles-mêmes comme un sous-produit automatique du processus. Pour le moment, nous cultivons notre esprit en silence, légèrement et doucement, pendant encore quelques instants. Maintenant notre esprit immobile au centre de nous-mêmes. Je renvoie chacun à sa propre méditation pour encore quelques instants en silence jusqu'à ce que nous arrivions au moment approprié.
Sappa Buddhanupavena, Sappa Dhammanupavena, Sappa Sankhanupavena, Sattha Soti, Bhavantu Te. So if you'd like to come to the end of your meditation for today, you can gradually open your eyes again. If you feel at all uncomfortable, then slowly try changing to a more comfortable position before gradually finishing your practice. So to return gently to the subject I've been talking about today, in other words, my recent trip to Indonesia, it turned out that during the short period I was there, my brief was mostly to do with giving talks for the novices. You might imagine some of the reasons that Buddhists, as a minority, have a hard time in Indonesia, but sometimes the source of those obstacles came from maybe places you might not have imagined. In other words, as a result of infighting between the different schools of Buddhism, which is ironic when you would think the biggest source of friction would be between the different religions. So this time I had the task of helping to engage in intra-religious dialogue. In this respect, we had a Chinese monk, Venerable Suhu Sakya Sukata, from Indonesia come and join us. In fact, all the people on the right-hand poster shown, whether it be Ramani Lida Melanie, Dr. Heru Suherman Lim, or Romo Putianto, were Buddhist educators from diverse Buddhist traditions, because Buddhists are allowed to have their own schools in Indonesia if they can get the minimum number to open a school. In those schools, children will be taught by lay or monastic teachers. So all the theory on Buddhism is provided to the kids, but for the practical understanding of those teachings, and obviously coming to ordination for 14 days in their end of year vacation, would also be very valuable for them. But many of the teachers had quite a lot of colorful experiences to share. The Chinese monk was telling me that some places he visited, he encountered black magic, intending to scare the monks away. He said one night he was sleeping and he dreamt he was being shot with blowpipe darts, Papua New Guinea style, and in his dream, blood was filling up his whole chest. But when he woke up in the morning, there was nothing to see. But he felt like there was something strange had happened while he was asleep, and it turned out that someone had put a sort of spell on him to make those Buddhists go away. So quite a lot of pushback for monks trying to do their duty. The other panelists were teachers in the schools, so they have constructed curricula and teach the children in those Buddhist colleges. They had a metaphor for the problems between Buddhists. They said it's a little bit like someone comes up and serves you with some food. And the food is good, but sometimes it comes packaged in different ways. Sometimes they give you the food wrapped in cling film. Sometimes they give it to you in a box. Sometimes they give it to you in a bag. And Buddhists are often so busy arguing about which is the best packaging that they forget to actually eat the food. And this is a metaphor for Buddhists arguing about, oh, my tradition is better and you're not the real deal. So they are so busy arguing about these things that no one actually gets down to serious practice. So they said it's time to overcome these differences because otherwise, when Buddhists are so few in the first place, it will only make things worse if they refuse to work together. The Chinese monk told me it's very hard to open a new temple or meditation center in Indonesia at all. And that might sound quite disastrous, but in fact, for the most part, temples are just places where people go to light incense and make wishes for their ancestors. So actually not having a temple is maybe not so much of a big deal. But Buddhists have been able to make a meaningful contribution more in terms of education. Since Indonesians generally respect education a lot, by going through the channel of education, they have managed to keep the tradition going. And this has been the case with our International Morality and Ethics Quiz Contest, called IMEC for short, where our volunteers have gained a lot of traction over the last 10 years or so. When I was teaching the novices, mostly, as you might imagine, they were just fascinated to hear a Westerner giving a talk about Buddhism, because somehow it counts for more than hearing the same thing from an Asian mouth. The novice was very excited about what I taught and had a lot of good questions from every session. So some of the sessions were just like basic Buddhism and so on. Others were more on practical aspects of what was called the rainbow of Buddhist diversity, which concerned how different sorts of Buddhists can get along better with each other. I was fortunate to have a translator, but that was quite a lot of work for them on my behalf. Indonesian language is a little bit special. I found it's actually quite close to Hawaiian language. It's as if in ancient times all the islanders traveled to visit each other and spoke to each other in slightly different dialects, meaning that all languages are related, which is quite incredible if you think about it. So there must have been a huge network of traveling between the islands in those days. So I worked through a translator, and this is the only way I could reach those novices who had English as their second language, but since they were kids, mostly they hadn't studied enough of it to access the English needed for the deeper abstract concepts that I want to talk about. So they had organized translators for me. The whole training project was conducted in a big tent because at Borobodur there's not really any buildings. It's just like a big park, so it was a little bit like stepping from the air-conditioned first world straight into the equatorial jungle. Nonetheless, the organizers did put up these wonderful big tents. You can imagine a tent large enough to take 500 people and without any central pillars. Well, it has several of these. One tent was for the actual training to take place. Other tents were for the novices to sleep or to hang up their ropes to dry, for the restroom facilities, for the canteen, and for the volunteers to stay. And they had to construct this whole thing rather like Coachella or Burning Man festivals. It's almost like a whole refugee camp there to accommodate no less than 1,000 people on site at any one time. So very major preparations. For all the restrooms and so on, they had to install their own running water and plumbing. The tents had some rudimentary swamp-style air conditioning, which kept them cool inside because they were contending with tropical heat. So some cooling systems helped to keep things bearable. However, there was a constant task of running repairs throughout the 2 weeks, so it was definitely a sight to be seen. So these days, Buddhists represent the majority only in 2 locations in Indonesia. Borobudur is one of them, located in central Java, and it attracts members of the Buddhist community to settle because it's an obvious place of pilgrimage. The other location is further north in the Meranti Islands between Sumatra and Singapore. Apart from these 2 places, Buddhists are really a very small minority. You'll notice from the map that there are 2 sorts of Islam in Indonesia. In Java, it's more moderate Islam, but coming in from Sumatra is a more radical trend, which makes it a lot harder for every other religion to practice. For example, wearing a headscarf is a fairly widely accepted Muslim practice, but these days, the radicals are insisting that girls in kindergarten wear the headscarf too. Instead of little kids being able to wear a skirt, they have to wear a dress that covers them down to their ankles and wrists. So these are the interpretations that were definitely not present in Indonesia before. They are ideas that have been imported from the Middle East. I don't know the details of things like whether schools are co-ed or segregated, but I do know that UNESCO is particularly worried about, for Indonesia, concerning the whole FGM phenomenon, and you can look it up for yourself if you don't know what that is. But certainly there's an international effort to re-educate young people to have a slightly more respectful attitude to the female body generally, because that has somehow gone adrift with the radicalization in Sumatra. So this is what Buddhists are trying to contend with, and the pushback they're getting sometimes means a Buddhist statue in a temple gets banned and removed by the neighbors who claim that it's idolatry or whatever. So it's an uphill struggle just to remain a Buddhist. In many places, Buddhists have become like an endangered species. So part of the reason I was invited to go all the way from the US to Indonesia was to give Buddhists the encouragement and boost their self-esteem, or at least to restore pride in their own chosen religion there, so that there can be a new generation for the future as well. Really, within Indonesian society, lots of people like Buddhism. It's not just Buddhists themselves, but Indonesians generally. For as long as the radical ones don't get to them, everyone is fine with Buddhism. Around Borobudur, you find a lot of self-identifying Muslims actually helping to sweep the place every day for free, because they enjoy helping out as volunteers. Among the 200 temple volunteers I mentioned, a lot of them are actually Muslims too. But they like to help out because their friends are also helping out in the same way. There are not clear demarcations along religious lines. However, the divisions between religion get more pronounced as radicalization increases, which is sad. In the old days, Indonesians got along really well between different religions. In some other countries where there has been tensions between religions, they used to send in the Indonesians to arbitrate because they were so good at it. So it'd be a shame to lose that goodwill. This picture actually shows the people turning out to see a procession of monks passing by. And in our branches in Indonesia, we also have Muslims who come to learn meditation alongside the morals and ethics quiz contest as well. So religious cooperation is not completely beyond the pale. But what I noticed for Muslims joining the ceremonies was that generally they would prefer not to be caught on camera, especially if it's obvious that they are learning about Buddhism. But others are more open-minded. So as long as you avoid dogmatism in Indonesia, it's a very interesting society. But at the same time, it's a question of how much you can say to encourage people to see the value of what they're practicing without reflecting negatively on other spiritual traditions in that country. Really, Indonesia has examples of every religion. You notice that some of the islands are more Christian or Hindu, Bali, for example. So there's really every variety of religion in that archipelago. So it's actually quite an interesting country if you ever have the chance to visit. So today I've been looking at my Indonesian themed travelogue for my next live session online, which will, fingers crossed, be a week on Sunday morning. We'll have a look at the topic of You Are Respected. So for good measure, I'd like to remind viewers that you can email your questions about meditation and what you've heard in the lecture to the email address that you can see spelled out on the slide, and I'll do my best to answer these on my next session. In the meantime, to avoid recklessness or complacency as we continue to deal with the knock-on health and economic effects of the pandemic, maintain a positive mood, speak only positive words, forgive others, extend good wishes to others, and meditate daily. Hopefully, as a result of today's session, you will learn to value the opportunity to really practice meditation and Buddhism in the country where you live. So, this is me, Phra Nicholas Thanissaro, signing off for now. So long, folks, and stay safe.